It's a pleasure for me to be with you this morning, and I told Scott that he didn't need spend a lot of time in the introduction because I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and just going to help as we go here. So it is a pleasure for me to be with you this morning. Lindsay contacted me a couple of months ago and asked if I'd consider coming up to Devil's Lake and speaking, and this is a topic I've spoken on a couple different times before. And what I hope to do today is tell you a little bit about some of the data behind resiliency, but maybe more importantly, tell you a little bit about some stories of people that have shaped my views of resiliency this morning. So who am I? As Scott mentioned, I have the privilege of serving as Vice President for Agricultural Affairs here at NDSU, which basically is the position that includes the roles of the Dean of the College of Agriculture, Director of NDSU Extension, and Director of Experiment Stations. I think I've got one of the best jobs, if not the best job, at NDSU because I get to work in all facets of agriculture, get to work with all kinds of great people across the state, and it's an industry I love. So I grew up in the very southwestern part of North Dakota, about 10 miles from the Montana border, north of a little town called Sentinel Butte. So my parents farmed and ranched there on a place that was homesteaded by my grandfather. And I grew up in a family of 5 boys. So I was the oldest of 5 boys. My mom and dad had 5 sons in the span of 6 years and 10 months. So it was a pretty busy household. We got into a lot of mischief over the years. But it was also a time if you're, some of you in this audience will recall what the 1980s were like. Growing up. And the 1980s were a pretty difficult time in farming and ranching. Interest rates were quite high. I remember my folks paying 18% interest on operating notes. We had droughts, we had grasshoppers, we had all sorts of challenges. And that's really where I learned a little bit from a practical standpoint about resiliency. The place I grew up on was homesteaded by my grandfather and my great uncle. So they homesteaded 2 L-shaped quarters on the edge of the Badlands and some land that probably should have never been farmed. But they had a house that sat right on the border of those 2 quarters. And so one lived on one side, one lived on the other side, and they homesteaded the 2 quarters back in the 30s. I'm married. I met my wife at NDSU. When Jason and I were students at NDSU, I met my wife. And she's from the Minot area, southwest of Minot, about 25 miles. We both love the outdoors. She's a runner, so she's ran all sorts of races all over the country, done several marathons. She's done Boston a couple times. So she's kind of a physical fitness person in our household. She's got me into being more conscious about my physical fitness. So she is kind of an inspiration to me in terms of resiliency. She's recovered from a couple of running injuries and still enjoys those activities, and she's also gotten our daughter into it. So our family has grown pretty rapidly in the last 6 years. So we have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Our oldest son got married in 2017. He lives in Bismarck. He's got 3 children. And then our second oldest son got married in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. He and his wife just had triplets in February. So these triplet babies came along. They were born about 9 weeks early, and our daughter-in-law was hospitalized on hospitalized bed rest for about 7 weeks ahead of that birth. And so also learned a little bit about resiliency from her because she was a trooper through that whole thing. She basically could get out of a hospital bed, go to the bathroom, take a shower, and get back in. That was her 7 weeks going through that pregnancy there at the end. The triplets were born February 25th, and they celebrated their 10th month birthday on Christmas Day. They were born about 3 pounds apiece. They're now 17 to 20 pounds. So I am very blessed to have those kids in my life. So if you look at a formal definition of resiliency, what you find if you went to the dictionary, there's a definition that goes something like this, which is basically the capacity or ability to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness. It's also, if we think about it in terms of physical matter, the ability of a substance or object to spring back to its original form or shape, or so elasticity. So if you think about it in terms of a physical thing, it's really, can you find your way back to your original form once you put under stress? And I think when I think of the stress that people are under, the pandemic was certainly an area where we all, I think, were stressed in various capacities. Many of us went through some very difficult times in terms of being removed from family and friends, isolated. But we also went through very difficult times in terms of the actual stress of grief and losing loved ones during that time. So I think we've all experienced some things that would be adverse conditions just recently. We've all had to deal with this in various ways. And if you look at the definition of adversity, adversity is really just defined as difficulty or misfortune. And many people can define that in many different ways. But I would say any of the things that you're experiencing in terms of farm stress, in terms of relationship stress, those all go in the category of adversity. And we've been very blessed in agriculture over the last decade or so to have really pretty good times financially. We haven't had a lot of financial stress during that time, but there will be times in the future where we're going to be stressed again. And we need to have these skills. We need to have resilience in order to be able to bounce back from some of those challenges that we're going to face. Resilient individuals are proven in the scientific literature to be more likely to experience happiness and joy. They're less likely to experience things like anxiety, sadness, moodiness, or jealousy. And so, in some ways, resiliency is really a mindset of an attitude of gratitude or understanding your circumstances, and even in the tough times, being able to be grateful and thankful for the things that were given. So I'll tell you a couple of stories that I think relate to resiliency and adversity that come from my own family history. So this is a picture of my grandfather and grandmother on their wedding day. This is on my father's side. They were married in the early 1930s. And so my grandfather and my great uncle had come west from Minnesota in the 1920s. They homesteaded a place north of Medora. They abandoned that homestead and moved to a little ranch farm north of Sentinel Beach, North Dakota. And my grandfather and grandmother got married in the early 1830s, kind of in the height of the Depression. And they had 10 kids on that farm. Basically, it was a farm that consisted of about a section of land. And they raised 10 children on that farm. They did all the sorts of things that many of your ancestors probably did on that farm. They milked cows, they raised turkeys, they had hogs, they had crops, a lot of different things to kind of survive in that time frame. And it wasn't always easy for them. They had many challenges, both from a financial standpoint, but also from just physical living standpoint. Their house had no running water. The house that I lived in for the first 4 years was that same house. It had no running water. It got electricity when the rural electric co-ops came in the 1950s. But my grandfather and grandmother were people of great faith, and they believed that they would be able to see things through, and they, in the end, were very successful at the things that they did. Now, on my grandmother's side, my grandmother and my grandfather on my mother's side lived in the same area. So you can actually see the two homesteads from the shelter belts. They're about 2 miles apart in front. But they were about 8 years younger than my paternal grandparents. But my grandfather, Greg, who I'm named after, he, in the 1930s, he hopped a freight train in Beach, North Dakota to go west to find work. So this had been December of about 1932. He jumped on a freight train, got in a boxcar, and was going to ride west to the Pacific Coast to find work and to make a living. My grandparents were not married at the time, but they knew each other. They'd been dating a little bit before he left. So he gets in this boxcar with one of his friends. And they start riding the rails west in hopes of getting to Washington. They got as far as Miles City, Montana, and they were actually locked in this box car. They could not get the door open. And so they're pounding on the door in the rail yard in Miles City, hoping that somebody would hear them. And finally, the rail yard manager heard the pounding on the door, came and let him out. And by the time that he was let out of the boxcar, the can of pork and beans in my grandfather's knapsack was frozen solid. So that tells you a little bit about how cold it was in that winter day when he got off that freight train. But he eventually rode the rails out into the Pacific Northwest, and for the next 7 years, he basically worked odd jobs all the way from a duty ranch in Kalispell, Montana, down to a sheep ranch in Northern California, and back and forth across Washington, Oregon, picking up a little bit of work, sending money home to his family, and then eventually came back to Western North Dakota in 1939. My grandmother was still waiting for him, so she had not married. She was still waiting for him at that point. They got married. They raised 7 children on their farm. And the youngest son was killed in the Vietnam War a month before I was born. And that had a profound effect on my mother, losing her youngest brother. And so that, I think, in a way, we started a cascade of events for a mother that was very difficult. My mother, throughout my childhood, suffered from depression and anxiety. And I can recall several times as a kid when my mother was not there. I can recall times where we were shipped off, and the 5 boys were kind of split up for a period of time, sent to my aunts and uncles' places to live so that my father could continue to care for the farm and she could get some help. That went on for a number of years. She continued to struggle with it. Really, at that point in time, to think about mental health in the 1970s, it was not a time where there was adequate treatment, especially in Western North Dakota, and there was a lot of stigma associated with mental illness, and I think it still is. But she continued to struggle with that, and she struggled with it throughout the 90s. In the late 1990s and 1997, she went through a severely chronic depression. She was actually hospitalized at the state hospital in Jamestown, North Dakota. And I was telling a friend about this last night, that my wife and I would go out to see her front part of Jamestown. And there were times where I never thought she was going to leave that institution. She struggled mightily for that about a 6-month period of time. And I remember one of my coworkers asked me, my wife, at what point did Greg's mother die? And my wife had to tell him that my mom was dead. But he thought that my mother had passed away because I never talked about it. And that me basically hiding that was my mechanism of coping with that adversity and that challenge. Eventually, my mother did get better. She was able to recover, but at the same time, wasn't able to go back to the financial stress of the farm and ranch that we lived on. So at age 61, my father left really the only place he'd ever known, and moved with my mother to Bismarck, North Dakota, and found a job there. And through that thick and thin, what we really, I think, overcame the adversity and the mental health challenge that she had. My mother passed away 10 years ago, but I have a lot of respect for the things that my father did to help her through that period of time. And my father's still living in Bismarck. He's a wonderful man, a very faith-filled man, a man of great character. But I will never forget the sacrifices that he made to make her life better and to help her recover from that bout of mental illness. So one of the ways that I process and deal with adversity and anxiety is I love nature. And so I love to get out and find the joy and the beauty in nature. And North Dakota is wonderful for that because you can find joy and beauty in every one of the four seasons if you look for it. And if you are deliberate about finding the beauty that exists in the early morning sunrise, or in frost covered fence posts or native flowers, native plants. I find a lot of comfort in being out with nature, being active, hiking and taking pictures and really understanding the creation that's surrounding us and the beauty that's there. So one of the good things about resilience is that actually it's a capacity that can be learned. Some people might say that if, resilient people are born with that trait. That's not true. If you look at the literature, the psychological literature will tell you that you can learn resilience and you can learn how to cope with things. There's really four components that make up the solid foundation around resilience. One of those is connection. So you need to have relationships. As human beings, we all need to have relationships. Some of us are obviously more extroverted than introverted, but all of us, whether we're extroverts or introverts, need relationships. We need that connection with humans. Another component is wellness. So part of resiliency is actually physically taking care of yourself. So being active physically, getting out, walking, running, biking, doing things outdoors, taking care of yourself physically, but also mentally. And then the third component is healthy thinking. And that's really where attitude and the ability to accept that things will change, and accepting those changes and then kind of move on from those. And then the fourth component is meaning. And can you find a purpose in life? And it's always important to be able to point back to a purpose and understanding why you're here and why you might have a particular role that you do, whether that's a father or a mother, whether that's like a friend, whether that's whether finding meaning in terms of your job, when you bring your career path. But we all need to find that purpose and that meaning in life. In order to become more resilient, sometimes we need to step back from some of the problems we face and break them down into smaller components. You sometimes need to focus on the first step of the problem rather than that huge problem that might be facing us. We need to break it down. You need to focus on the positives. I found that gratitude is a very powerful builder of resiliency. About 7 years ago, I started doing a little thing called the gratitude journal. So every day I write down 3 to 5 things that I'm thankful for. Usually it's pretty simple things. Might be seeing a sunrise, might be a hug from one of my grandkids, might be coffee with a friend, but finding things every day, even in the worst days, that you can point to that you're grateful for is really important. Building that support network, developing relationships with friends, family, coworkers, colleagues, those connections is very, very important in terms of your ability to be resilient. I found this quote the other day, and I had to read it a couple of times because it didn't quite make sense to me at first. It said, you can't change the people around you, but you can change the people around you. And if you think about the irony in that statement, it's very true. If we think we can change the people that we're with, we're going to become quite frustrated. But there are times when, in order to become resilient, we need to move away from certain people. There are certain people in our lives that may not be the best influence on us. And so you can't change people around you, but you can change the people you surround yourself with. It's a better way to say it. Take care of yourself. And again, it's very important in terms of physical health. It has a direct correlation to your ability to bounce back from some of these challenges. Know your limits. Understand, where your limits are. And also, I found it helpful to remember that simple serenity prayer. God grant me the ability to encouraged to change the things that I can change, but the wisdom to understand the things that I cannot change. Too often, part of our anxiety and challenges that we face are caused by us wanting to change something that we're never going to be able to change. And the sooner we can understand the things we can actually control, and the things we can, and the difference between the two, the better off we'll be. It's also important in terms of behavior change to remember that you're going to be more successful if you approach this trying to be aggressive. You're not going to accomplish these things all at once. And you have to be compassionate with yourself. You have to give yourself the grace to know that you're going to falter along the way and probably make some mistakes. So just as I close up here, I'll be happy to entertain any questions or discussion, but if you want to connect with me on social media, you can find me Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I do have a Twitter account, but I'm not a very good tweeter. I guess it's an X account now, but I'm not very good at keeping up with that. But these are the three social media accounts that I try to keep active with. And so, Lindsay, with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions or discuss anything with the audience that they might want to use about. Yeah, Brett's question is, from my standpoint, working in NDSU, do I see generational differences in resiliency? And I would say part of the answer to that, Brad, is yes. And part of it is because we have created in some situations an atmosphere where we've not let our children and grandchildren fail. And part of the way you learn resiliency is you actually experience failure. And you have to experience some tough times. I mean, the stories I've told you about my grandparents, those developed resiliency in part because they faced some incredibly difficult situations. And I think we've had a tendency in our society to want to put a bubble around our kids and not let them fail, not let them experience a failure, and it's actually not good for them. And so I do see some generational differences there. It's not universal. I mean, there certainly are kids that are coming to college, out of high school that are very resilient, but I would say in general, we've created some situations that aren't altogether healthy for that generation.